Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line. The Russians have managed to advance in the northern flank of Toretsk and the southern flank of Kościantynivka, with additional advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and within the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Ukrainians in turn managed to continue their counterattacks in the direction of Counterattacks in the western parts of the Russian Sumy incursion. These recent developments show that the Russians continued offensive operations centered around the Kościantynivka and Pokrovsk directions, while the Ukrainians continued their attempts at recapturing Counterattacks following the Russian capture of it a couple of months back. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians made numerous advances here in the southwestern outskirts, gaining control over additional forest lines and fields here west of Myrne, north of Voskresenka, in the direction of Alexandrorad. The Russians are developing offensive operations towards the three defensive positions of the Ukrainians, the town of Alexandrorad, and the two defensive lines to the north of it, near Andreevka, Klevtsove, and in between the two towns. At the same time, the Russians managed to advance in the direction of Bila within the Dnipropetrovsk region as they continued offensive operations in the direction of Novopavlivka. Gaining control over the southern and western flanks of the town allows them to focus their forces on storming the town without having to worry about Ukrainian counterattacks that will have to cross over a river line. With that, the Russians are looking to gain control over Bila before storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. With regards to fortified positions, there is the fortified position here west of Novosibirsk, which the Ukrainians continue to hold on to despite the Russian capture of Novomykolaiivka and Novosibirsk. The reason for this is that it was shown with some footage. This is likely drone footage from very close up. The fortified positions here are centered around some concrete bunkers that are built underground into the trench network. This is why it's been difficult for the Russians to capture it. The FAB bombs do not penetrate the concrete fortifications underground. Instead, they would need to use bunker buster, which is too expensive for a fortified position. Instead, they would need to storm the fortified positions themselves with infantry and armored vehicles to gain control of it. Alternatively, which is looking what they might do, they can ignore it completely and bypass it by storming positions such as Udashne, gain control over that, and then moving onwards towards Molodetsk and Novopidhorodne. Gaining control over the settlements around it will allow the Russians to encircle it and ignore it completely, what the Ukrainians will eventually have to withdraw from it, surrender, or starve out. It will, however, act as a thorn on the side of the Russian forces as long as the Russians do not capture it and the Ukrainians hold on to it. The Russian offensive operations here to the southwest of Pokrovsk are centered around the wider front line, not just the western flank of Pokrovsk, but also the southern section of the front line, which is why it's one of the main axes of the Russian offensive operations, and will continue to advance in this section until they achieve their goals, which is to flank the western parts of Pokrovsk and to flank the defensive lines of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia region. Further north in the direction of Popov, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the town, the western and eastern flanks of it, reaching into Poltavka from the southern flank. The Russians here developed offensive operations to gain control over the settlements of Rosenyar, Poltavka, and Popov to gain control over the central plains here in between Kościantynivka and Pokrovsk. Gaining control over these areas here, the three settlements, will allow the Russians to start fighting over Mykolaiv and the settlements on the western flank of Kościantynivka. For the southern operational encirclement of the city, the Russians to operationally encircle Kościantynivka need to gain control over the settlements on the northern and southern flanks of the city, and these three settlements open the road for the last defensive line of the Ukrainians ahead of the operational encirclement of the city. The southeast of Kościantynivka, the Russians made a significant advance, gaining control over several fortified positions, fields, and the town of Bila on the southeastern flank of Kościantynivka. The Russians gained control over the fortified positions on the eastern parts of Bila, which allowed them to storm into the central parts of the town. They're now fighting on the very western outskirts of the settlement, just outside the town of Oleksandro-Sheltene. The Russians with this advance have made significant progress towards connecting the Chasiv and Toretsk sections of the front line. This also shows that the Ukrainians, with their operation to reopen the operational encirclement on the western flank of Toretsk, have paid the price of losing their positions in the direction of Bila, as the Russians were able to launch these offensive operations, taking advantage of the gaps in the defenses of the Ukrainians that opened up with the redirection of forces towards this counterattack. The Russians, with this offensive push, gaining control over Bila, the fortified positions and the fields, are now within the second line of defense of Konstantinivka. Gain control over Oleksandr Shultine will allow the Russians to break through the second line of defense and onwards to the final line of defense just outside the city. However, the Ukrainians will still be able to hold on to their defenses in the southeast, as they have the significant fortified layers to the south of the city in the direction of Ivanopilia, Pleshivka, and Ivanopilska. With this, the Russians will now be focusing on the forest patch and fields here to the north of Bila to connect their forces between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. This will significantly improve the logistical situation for the Russian forces on the eastern flank of Konstantinivka, and the Russians will escalate the offensive operations west of Chasiv Yar to gain control over the settlements on the northern flank of Konstantinivka for the operational encirclement of the city. It also allows Russians to have a buffer zone and defensive line on the northern flank of Toretsk, which allowed them to redirect their forces to the southern flank and counterattack the Ukrainian counterattacks to restart the operational encirclement of the Ukrainian forces and close the pocket itself to gain control over Chervenivka, Katerinivka, and Klebenbyk here to the west of Toretsk, further securing the city as a logistical hub for the Russian forces in this section of the front line. The recent Russian capture of Yablonivka and the continuous fighting over Oleksandro Kalinove also points to the Russians gaining full control over the southern flank of Konstantinivka, allowing them to focus their efforts on the flanks of the city for the operational encirclement of it. In the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians continued their counterattacks in the direction of Kindrativka, where they managed to gain control over the northern and western parts of the town yet again. This is confirmed with this duplicated footage of Russian FAB strikes on the bridge here in the central parts across the two ponds. With this, the Russians have withdrawn back across from the bridges and are establishing defensive lines alongside the river line itself to prevent a Ukrainian breakthrough. This recent Ukrainian advance that turned around the situation following the Russian counterattack is due to additional reinforcements arriving to the town, and that pushed the Russians back into the outskirts, the eastern outskirts of it, while the Russians are also restarting offensive operations in the direction of Andrivka, where they're looking to regain a foothold within the town. The Russians started a bombing campaign over the town of Kindrativka following the Ukrainian additional reinforcements arriving into the town, so they withdrew from the western parts and northern parts of it, heavily bombarded it with FAB bombs, and now they'll likely look to counterattack back across the bridges that were blown up. The Russians will look to flank from the south as they have not blown out the southern bridge, which allowed them to bypass the positions of the Ukrainians and cut off the supply route to regain control of the supply routes, will allow the Russians to safely push into the northern and western parts of the town. The recent developments across the front line continue to show that the Russians are building up the offensive capabilities in the eastern section of the front line, but are waiting for the operational encirclement of Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk before starting their new offensive. Will likely be one where they'll be bypassing the two cities and look to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians by gaining control over the rear of Donetsk. We'll likely also see additional offensive operations towards the other regions such as Zaporizhia and Kherson, with additional pushes across the border area. The reported number of soldiers available for offensive operations are 200,000 soldiers. This can cover a wide section of the front line, as the Russians already have a significant amount of soldiers in the southern section of the front line. These 200,000 can almost be fully dedicated to the northern section of the front line, from the border area between the Belgorod and Kharkiv region to the Bryansk-Chernihiv region. This will have a significant impact on the southern section of the front line, because the Ukrainians will be forced to choose between defending the northern section and the southern section of the front line from the Russian offensive operations, to which they will likely choose the northern section, as a 200,000 soldier offensive could threaten Kiev itself, and that is something that Ukraine will not be accepting, while the loss of the southern regions is something else entirely, because the local population in these areas are not as supportive for the war as the ones in the northern and western parts of the country. It will also be easier to negotiate a peace deal if the Russians have achieved their territorial goals, and giving up those territories is easier politically for the Ukrainians than giving up regions such as Sumy, Chernihiv, or Kharkiv. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.